we've tried to understand the coordinated movements of the intrinsic joints of the foot, how they occur, why they occur, and why they do it together in a coordinated manner. So Hicks, of course, was at the forefront with axes of movement at the intrinsic joints. And his comment was, the Talo-calcaneo-navicular joint complex is evidently difficult to comprehend, which was an understatement. Fick had suggested that the subtalar joint had a simple hinge joint movement, and it rotated about a line passing obliquely through the head of the talus. Mauter had the same idea, and if you remember, Jones built a little wooden model with an oblique hinge to demonstrate the torque movement in the tibia, which produced movement in the long axis of the foot. And he considered that one aspect of this was to alter the distribution of weight from side to side of the foot, which of course was pretty good. Now these interrelated movements, as I have shown you before, can easily be shown. The synchronous rotation of the midfoot into pronation and supination, and rotation of the tibia. External rotation and supination, external rotation of the tibia and supination of the midfoot are clearly seen there. And then we go into pronation and internal rotation. And we're back to neutral. External rotation and supination. Internal rotation of the tibia and pronation of the midfoot. And we've demonstrated that the ankle moves medially and laterally with these movements. Now the last four of those references are related to stereophotogrammetric studies, and they were mainly concerned with joint axes and relative motion at the joints, relative motion of particular parts of the foot to each other. And for many years, as you know, they've been described, movements have been described as occurring around axes, and these often were shown to be crossing more than one joint. Some joints were even given two axes. There was the Talo-calcaneo-navicular axis, and then in the transverse mid-tarsal joint, there were oblique and longitudinal axes described. But in fact, there are no structural hinges present in the foot. You can't see them. And Huson very wisely said that the movement must depend upon the contour of the joint surfaces and the ligamentous control, so that there was a certain pattern. So that was published in 1961. And one of the interesting things was that he described and defined so-called open and closed chain movements, although Bertil says that I should say not closed chain, but constrained chain. You can take it as you leave it. But open chain movement, one end of the chain of joints is free to move in space. So open chain, the foot can pronate or supinate. But when movement is restricted at the ends of a series of linkages, Huson says the structure then forms a closed chain. In other words, if you have movement at the middle of the chain, there's got to be some compensation in between that movement and the constrained ends. Now, this must be present, constrained or closed chain movement is present when the foot is balancing. in the coronal plane. The talar dome remains nearly horizontal, the forefoot remains plantigrade, while the midfoot posture alters, it rotates into supination and pronation. Midfoot is twisted into supination and then into pronation. But the ankle remains reasonably horizontal, and so does the forefoot. It remains plantigrade. So we must have compensatory movements at the front and the back of the foot. So when the midfoot is supinated, we must have some pronation of the forefoot and some in the hindfoot, and the opposite way round if the midfoot is pronated. Now this forefoot movement can be explained by Hicks's forefoot twist. In actual fact, he described this in relationship to compensating for slopes of the ground. So that if the ground sloped that way, the metatarsals could just do that, and if the ground sloped that way, the metatarsal heads could do the other way. On one side, we could have the metatarsals plantarflexing and dorsiflexing on the other to give a pronation twist, and the opposite to give a supination twist. But this was of the metatarsal heads. Now if we leave that for the moment and just come to this transverse tie bar, because when we were investigating the transverse tie bar with a dissected forefeet, we just happened to wonder what made the front of the foot stable in relationship to the rest of it. Okay, we had something that stopped the metatarsal head splaying, but what did that do in relationship to the rest of the foot? What stabilized the front of the foot and kept it in alignment? And we had the idea and noticed that the second and third rays, as Dodonka and Kowalski had described, didn't move very much in a lateral direction. We couldn't find any study in which this particular lateral swing movement of the central metatarsals in relationship to the midfoot had been investigated. So my splendid Mrs. Harkins dissected 3 feet and left the transverse tie bar intact. And we placed each foot in this apparatus. Steinman's pins were placed through the navicular, through the navicular and the cuboid and the hind foot, so that the middle of the foot was stabilized. And the forefoot was resting on this platform. And then we put pins as markers in the various skeletal spots, such as metatarsal heads and bases of metatarsals. And we applied traction to each metatarsal. We put hooks around each of the metatarsals in turn around their necks, so that it had quite a leverage pull relative to the basal joint. And these were attached to weights, which were 2 kilogram weights. So each metatarsal with a hook around its neck was pulled medially and then laterally. And this was done first with the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments intact. And then after we'd done that series, we divided the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments progressively and assessed how much lateral swing of each metatarsal had been increased. And we measured it, how much increase in the lateral movement of the metatarsals occurred. So this was the lateral movement of each metatarsal when the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments were intact, and 2 kilograms traction was applied laterally and medially. And you can see that the second and third metatarsals hardly moved at all. They were absolutely stable relatively to the navicular and the cuboid. There was a reasonable amount, a little, of the first metatarsal medial movement, and the fourth and fifth moved a little laterally. And then, so we had a stable central segment, as it were. Second and third metatarsals appeared to be laterally stable. And then we divided the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments. And immediately, the first metatarsal swung away quite markedly, just as though we'd given them hallux valgus, as it were, and the first metatarsal drifted medially. The second and third were hardly altered at all. They were still stable relative to the navicular and the cuboid. The fourth hardly increased, but the fifth, of course, did. So we concluded that the second and third metatarsals had ligamentous stability at their basal joints, which kept them in alignment in relationship to the navicular and cuboid, even if you divided the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments. Now, if you look at various illustrations of capsular and plantar ligaments, the various things, they all seem to converge towards the middle of the foot, in other words, towards the second and third metatarsal rays. And if you look at the descriptions, there are strong navicular cuboid interosseous ligaments, and between the cuboid and the cuneiforms, between the proximal row of the navicular and the intermediate and the lateral cuneiform, strong dorsal plantar ligaments. And the base of the second is firmly held in an intercuneiform recess and surrounded by interosseous ligaments. The third is surrounded by interosseous ligaments again. And there's considerable interosseous ligament attachment to the base of the fourth. And the lateral cuneiform is held in an intermetatarsal recess. So there are loads of ligaments around the base of the second and third metatarsals going back towards the cuboid and the navicular. So there was an explanation for the lateral stability of the second and third rays. So we had the hypothesis that there was a stable central forefoot segment and that there was lateral stability from the navicular and cuboid down towards the second and third metatarsal heads. This, as described by Dodonko and Kowalski, meant that the first metatarsal ray was a supporting metatarsal on the medial side, and the fourth and fifth did the same laterally, just like their little tricycle. Now, when you come to look at the forefoot twist, of course, this was for sloping ground. But if you just rotated his twist and made the metatarsal heads horizontal, then one had a mechanism for pronation and supination twist of the midfoot, or at least a mechanism that would compensate for pronation and supination in the midfoot to keep the metatarsal heads level. So if the midfoot went into supination or pronation, the plantar surface of the metatarsal heads could remain level if the outer metatarsals did a twist in the opposite direction. So if the midfoot became pronated, the peripheral metatarsals did a supination twist around the stable segment in the middle. So we could provide an explanation for compensation movement in the forefoot if there was supination or pronation in the midfoot. And we did a little reconstruction with the skeleton. I rescued it from the attic. And that's the tilt of the midfoot, because I've drawn it across the dorsal surfaces of the middle and lateral cuneiforms. And this is supposedly a neutral posture. There is the central forefoot segment, second and third metatarsals, middle lateral cuneiforms, cuboid, navicular. So if that goes into pronation in the midfoot area, or supination, the metatarsals have to twist in the opposite direction to keep the forefoot horizontal. So, we made it go through a range of movement of 20 degrees. This 20 degrees keeps on cropping up just because that's for comparison. So if we have pronation, the peripheral metatarsals have to supinate and move up and down. And of course they're all tied together by the transverse tibia, and they've got pressure from the ground to put them into that position. The midfoot segment is supinated, so the peripheral bones must pronate and go up and down. So it seemed reasonable to suggest that there was a stable central forefoot segment which could supinate and pronate, and that the forefoot, the metatarsal heads, could be kept reasonably horizontal if Hicks's forefoot twist occurred, and the forefoot could remain plantigrade. Now Hicks realised that if you pronated or supinated the midfoot, then there would be some effect upon the hindfoot. So there we are, the midfoot is pronating or on the right side and supinating on the left, and there would have to be some rotations in the opposite direction. But no one managed to explain the mechanism of how this occurred. So we've managed to explain the compensatory rotation in the forefoot to support the idea that we have a longitudinal four-part structured foot. The toes and the tibia system. We've got a central stable forefoot segment which can rotate and have compensatory rotations on either side. The forefoot twist. And at the back we've got the calcaneus and the talus, and they somehow or other have got to provide compensatory movement so that the talar dome can remain horizontal. We need a hindfoot mechanism, and this proved a challenge. Help was available from Ambagsha in his paper of 1978. He'd related movements of individual tarsal bones to the ground, in other words, its surroundings, as well as to each other, in a photographic study. And Huson had investigated intertarsal joint movements in relation to the contour of the articular surfaces and the restrictions on movement of the controlling ligaments. He was of the opinion that in the subhuman primates, that's lemurs and monkeys, the most obvious aspect of movement is rotation about the long axis of the foot, and that this produced pronation and supination of the forefoot. So in other words, it was just like our movement in the upper limb, except this movement occurs in the forearm, the pronation and the supination. Lewis says, no, in the monkeys, this occurs in the tarsal region. And he considered that at the calcaneo-cuboid joint there was a longitudinal axis about which this rotation occurred. So there we are, pronated, around that axis, supinated. And so you can grip the branches from the side or from above, if you're a monkey. In Homo sapiens, as I've mentioned before, movement of the calcaneus is considered, as Lewis mentioned, as happens in the weight-bearing foot. Rotatory movement still occurs, but now as a greatly amplified angular or swing movement. Now, when you see those two diagrams, which are not superimposed or accurately related to each other, you don't really understand, as I've mentioned before, just how obvious this swing movement is. But if you do that, then you see very clearly that there is a lateral swing movement, which he has illustrated, and that the talus rotates as well. He noted that in the laterally angulated swing position, the calcaneo-cuboid joint was maximally congruent, with the plantar convexity of the cuboid impacted into its slot under the sustentaculum tali. I hadn't really thought about the beak of the cuboid, or the slot, the coronoid fossa, underneath the sustentaculum tali. But I got out my skeleton and had a look. There is a prominent beak at the medial side of the proximal cuboid articular surface. And correlated with this is the slot or the coronoid fossa on the calcaneus, just below the sustentaculum tali. With outward swing movement at the transverse tarsal joint, and the calcaneo-cuboid joint therefore, the cuboid beak is impacted into its slot. And he thought that the whole joint was then maximally congruent, and the ligaments were tight. So having had this brought to our attention that very, very firmly that there was this lateral swing movement, and it looked as though it probably did occur. We looked for it clinically and radiologically. We began to accept that rising and falling of the longitudinal arch was probably not the major change in foot posture. So we began to look for the evidence and the reasons and the mechanisms for lateral swing movement at the transverse tarsal joint. Clinical studies, anatomical studies, radiological, and then just using the foot skeleton. Had some beautiful dissections done, showing the ligaments. Cine radiography, and practiced with a foot skeleton. And then we related the findings to previous reports in the literature. So the cine radiograph. That foot is pronated, and from that position we went up into high heel elevation. And you can see that the midfoot is supinated, and there's been a lateral swing movement at the transverse tarsal joint level. So here is the cine bits from pronation, a pronated flat foot, to a supinated heel elevated foot. And back down again. Now I want you to watch the second and third metatarsal heads, because as we repeat that and heel elevation occurs and the foot supinates, you will see that the first ray actually shortens as weight is taken off the first metatarsal head, and splay decreases on the medial side. But the second and third metatarsal heads hardly move at all. So it looked as though Hicks's metatarsal twist was actually quite genuine, and that we could twist over and just have the outer metatarsals heads weight bearing and come medially and have them all. And then we did the great toe extension test, and this was an absolute revelation to me. We put sticks at the mid-tarsal area, and for the posterior view we had them sticking sideways so you could see them from behind. And for the anterior view, then the stick was pointing up vertically, and it was seen in relationship to a stick on the front of the tibia. So watch the midfoot rotation in the coronal plane. There is some external rotation of the tibia, of course, but the real thing is looking at this mid-tarsal stick. And you see just how much supination in the midfoot actually occurs. It's extraordinary in the external rotation of the tibia. And the forefoot is still flat on the ground, and the tibia is vertical. Now we go back into pronation as the toe is taken down, and you can see the inward angulation occurring at the transverse tarsal joint and the correction of the supination of the midfoot. There it is, fully pronated. There it is, fully supinated, and the rotation movement is 20 degrees. If you look at the middle of the ankle, then when the foot is pronated from a neutral position, the ankle moves medially, back to neutral, and when it's supinated, the ankle moves laterally. Quite a lot. tibia is vertical. It doesn't stray from that very much. The ankle remains horizontal, therefore, and so does the forefoot. So we have Huson's constrained or closed chain movement very nicely demonstrated. These little marks are just the outer margin on one side and the inner margin of the midfoot to show how much lateral swing there is. So really we confirm Professor Lewis's observations. There was indeed considerable lateral swing movement at the midfoot. So that's a mark at the base of the stick in neutral position. Midfoot supination, forefoot plantigrade. So that's what we think happens as regards the metatarsal twist of Hicks, as it compensates for mid-tarsal rotation. There's the midfoot movement looked at from behind, 20 degrees. What about the calcaneus? It was only 10 degrees, half as much. So we can make little diagrams and show that with a great toe extension test and supination of the midfoot bones, the navicular and the cuboid, are rotating through 20 degrees, but the calcaneus only rotates 10. We know from various radiological studies, and actually doing the movements with the skeleton, that there is medial and lateral swing at the midfoot. And the talus internally and externally rotates with these movements. So this all fits with the 20 degrees of supination of the navicular and the cuboid and 10 degrees of the calcaneus. And at the same time, there is midfoot elevation, greater on the inside because of the supination twist of the navicular and the cuboid. And also, the talus moves physically, laterally and medially, and the talus internally and externally rotates. So Ambagsha, I'm sure you are all familiar with this. He studied the three-dimensional movements of the individual bones of the foot using this cage. Top of the tibia was fixed with a device that he could rotate the tibia, and the foot was on an island in the middle with a stopper opposite the cuboid so that it wouldn't rotate. And then he looked at the movements of the individual bones in the foot as he rotated the tibia from above. He put pins into the foot bones, which could be seen in all three planes, sagittal, coronal, and horizontal, and then he took photographs as he rotated the tibia. He could then measure the rotational movements in three planes of each individual bone. And these were his diagrams that he ended up with in the coronal plane. And although there was a stopper opposite the cuboid, you can see very clearly the lateral swing movement of Lewis at the transverse tarsal joint and the internal and external rotation of the talus. And in the coronal view from the back, his talus remains reasonably horizontal. The midfoot actually supinates further than the calcaneus. We'll come to that. So this was the starting position. There was the block. He supinated the talus, or the tibia, and we got that. Lateral swing movement. Metatarsal heads remained reasonably plantigrade. The talus was reasonably horizontal. And then when you looked at it, the talus had externally rotated through 33 degrees. The calcaneus only 16, half. Cuboid and navicular had not rotated at all in the horizontal plane, but then this was not surprising. There was a great big block preventing it moving. Calcaneus, external rotation, half as far as talus. The cuboid and the navicular had supinated through quite a considerable degree, between 23 and 29 degrees. The calcaneus, only 12 degrees. So here again he was showing, way back in 1978, that the midfoot rotated twice as far as the calcaneus. It was very clear that the cuboid and the navicular tended to move together. And that the calcaneus was again half the range of movement as regards plantar flexion. So the calcaneus was shown to be a halfway link between the talus and the cuboid. Okay, the talus externally rotated much more, and the cuboid and the navicular supinated much more. The talus hardly supinated at all. And there was this link between external rotation of the talus, therefore, and supination of the midfoot. Just like the little model of a obliquely hinged triangle. And he demonstrated the link between the navicular and the cuboid, and that they moved together. So he found that there were combinations of relative movements at three joints, the talo-navicular, calcaneo-cuboid, and the talo-calcaneo, and that they were always the same. The combination was always the same. If there was inward angulation of the midfoot, the talus internally rotated. If there was outward angulation, the talus externally rotated. Pretty obvious, really. The midfoot would flatten if there was inward angulation at the midfoot level. And the distal bones would undergo pronation, external rotation, and dorsiflexion at those joints. So we had combinations where there was pronation, external rotation, and dorsiflexion paired. And if it went the other way, if the talus externally rotated, the midfoot would elevate, and the distal bones were found to go under supination, internal rotation, and plantar flexion. Now you think, gosh, all these arrows and things. But if you remember SIPFA and PED, then you can start to work out the movements that occur at these three joints. Rotational movements of the navicular and cuboid relative to the ground are invariably the same. which supports the idea of a central forefoot segment. And the calcaneus tended to move half as far as the talus and naviculo-cuboid. So there were two very important observations. With outward angulation, the distal bones at each of these three joints underwent supination, internal rotation, and plantar flexion. And when they went inwards, the distal bones at each of these joints underwent pronation, external rotation, and dorsiflexion. So the proximal bones at each joint underwent the opposite, obviously, relative to each other. Now this is all very interesting, but how do we fit it all together? The navicular and the cuboid move together, which supports our idea of a central forefoot segment. Now in his original diagrams, Amberger clearly showed this inward and outward swing movement. Yet for years, the postural foot changes have been described only in relationship to the arch rising and falling, and very little has been said about Lewis's lateral swing movement. So what we know is that we've got, I think, a longitudinal beam structure with a central forefoot segment. We know that if that segment rotates, the rotatory movements of the calcaneus are about half. It's a halfway house. So if the midfoot supinates like that, we know that the talus is going to stay horizontal, and we know that the calcaneus will supinate only half that distance. So I've got it a lighter colour. The forefoot has compensatory pronation. The calcaneus only supinates half as far, so it is, in fact, relatively pronated. So it is undoing the supination of the midfoot. We're getting a mechanism. And the talus is not doing it at all, so it is pronated relative to the calcaneus. And it's the opposite on the other side if the midfoot pronates and the central segment pronates. Calcaneus pronates only half as far, and so it is relatively supinated. And of course the talus doesn't at all, so it's fully supinated and compensated relative to the navicular and the cuboid. Now I hope you understand that the midfoot goes that, the calcaneus doesn't go only as far, only half as far, and the talus doesn't do anything at all on both sides. And then there's the forefoot twist compensating at the front. Now, we had the dissections and we looked at radiographs, and more recently we had the gift of a three-dimensional MRI scan from some unknown radiologist in the United States, which has been absolutely wonderful. The dissection shows the midfoot with inward midfoot swing. And I think you can see that the calcaneo-cuboid joint is tight and closed on the lateral side. Yes? Here there's outward midfoot swing. So it's come this way and the cuboid has slid medially relative to the calcaneal distal articular surface. And even at this stage, can I point out to you that the talus has moved backwards and the articular surface of the posterior joint of the calcaneal facet is exposed because the talar facet has moved backwards. Here it has moved forwards with the inward angulation. Now, in fact, it's been known for a long time that talus moves backwards and forwards on the calcaneus in lateral X-rays, and the sinus tarsi has been larger and smaller. But no one's really explained why the gap sinus tarsi alters to such a degree. With outward swing, the foot is supinated, the midfoot is supinated. With inward swing, the midfoot is pronated. That is pronated, that is supinated, and you can see the talus is slid backwards over the calcaneus. You can see the articular surface exposed laterally of the talus and the cuboid with the outward angulation, but closed with pronation. And there's the backward movement. Now, looking at the calcaneo-cuboid joint, it's rather like a tongue and groove joint. It's got a concave, convex, sliding surface. So it can move medially and laterally. And those are the X-rays taken with the midfoot supinated and pronated. There's the posterior translation of the talus when supinated. Now, this calcaneal curvature, concavity, actually moves upwards medially and ends in the coronoid fossa. So when there is outward angulation, the beak moves medially and upwards into that fossa, and therefore the cuboid automatically supinates. Now I'll try and do this very slowly. Outward midfoot angulation, the cuboid slides medially and the midfoot supinates. So it's inward angulation above, outward below. Is that all right? There we are. That's inward angulation, both of them, and then we move to the outward angulation below. Cuboid beak has gone into its coronoid fossa, and as it does that, it supinates. Just compare the outline of the cuboid there with the one there, and you see that it has supinated, as well as angled inwards, as you see at the bottom here. And it plantarflexes. There we are, inwardly angulated. And when we outwardly angulate, the cuboid not only angles inwards and supinates, but it plantarflexes. So we've got SIPFA of the cuboid relative to the calcaneus. So that explains the rising of the longitudinal arch, so-called, because when the cuboid moves medially with outward angulation to the transverse tarsal joint, there is plantar flexion of the distal part of the foot. Sipfer. Very difficult to explain. If you haven't quite organised it in your mind, then I'm sorry, but these are the movements in the three planes that the cuboid makes in relationship to the calcaneus. So there at the above are the ligaments that you can see when the midfoot is pronated and inwardly angulated, the midfoot. And you can see that all the ligaments are tight. Below, the midfoot is supinated, and not all the ligaments are tight. The lateral bifurcate controlling the calcaneo-cuboid is tight in both. The plantar ligaments are always tight, the short plantar. The articular surface of the distal calcaneus and the talus are exposed. There we are, because of the lateral angulation. And the midfoot is supinated. Therefore, the calcaneus is relatively pronated. The plantar and the dorsal ligaments of the calcaneo-cuboid joint remain tight throughout this range of movement, and this is well documented. The joint therefore remains stable throughout its range of movement. Calcaneo-cuboid. The movement is pivotal around the proximal attachments of these dorsal and plantar ligaments. The pattern is predictable. The distal bone with outward angulation undergoes supination, internal rotation, plantar flexion. We have confirmation that this movement has only one axis from the various stereophotogrammetric studies that show that the calcaneo-cuboid joint axis is single. And that line goes through the proximal attachments of the dorsal and plantar ligaments. So we suggest that of pivotal importance of the movements of the three joints is the calcaneo-cuboid. It acts like a lateral hinge. If there is inward angulation at the transverse tarsal joint, medial angulation, then the distance between the calcaneus and the navicular will increase. It widens on the medial side. And the talus then slides forwards. Hence the X-ray appearances when you X-ray a foot, pronated foot, the talus has moved forwards. With lateral angulation, the lateral hinge has a nutcracker effect. The navicular moves towards the calcaneus, and in particular the sustentaculum tali. And the navicular pushes the talus backwards, up over the calcaneus. And here I'm rescued by this wonderful three-dimensional MRI scan. It has just arrived from various people, it's been passed on with the information that anyone can use it for their benefit. Yes, yeah. These are, I think, very beautiful three-dimensional MRI scans showing step-by-step movement of the intrinsic joints relative to each other. As you will see, it is obviously done on a cadaver with the metatarsals severed, but the movements are still at the three major joints that we're concerned with. They still fit in with all the recorded movements that are in the literature and with what we have found in our studies. So there is the concave, convex outline of the calcaneo-cuboid joint. And remember that at the medial end of that, the cuboid has its beak, and that calcaneal surface curves upwards medially to end in the coronoid fossa. You can see the slope of the posterior talo-calcaneal joint. And in this particular view, the midfoot is pronated and there is inward angulation at the midfoot, and the talus has slid all the way down that posterior joint. So watch at first the calcaneo-cuboid joint, and the cuboid will slide medially over the calcaneus and it supinates. So we're going to get outward angulation and the central forefoot segment is going to supinate, which is what we observed with our clinical studies. And then in the next stage you can see the talus go backwards. So here's the midfoot supinating, and there's the cuboid beak moving medially, and it's in its coronoid fossa.
Tibia rotates outward.
Yep. So is the talus. Is that all right? Go back again. Pronated midfoot. It's going to supinate and angle outwards, the lateral swing movement. The cuboid swings medially and its beak goes into the coronoid fossa. So we're going to do the same thing again, lateral swing of the forefoot segment and supination of the midfoot. Watch the talus being pushed backwards, and also observe that the calcaneus supinates, but not as far as the navicular and the cuboid. It does a halfway house. Both the calcaneus and the talus externally rotate, but the talus twice as much as the calcaneus. Can you see that talus rapidly externally rotating and being pushed backwards? Somebody say yes. And there, the anterior part of the articular surface of the posterior joint of the calcaneal side is exposed anteriorly because the talar joint has moved backwards. Again, is that clear? And of course the cuboid beak is snugly in its. So we reverse, and the talus slides forwards, and it internally rotates faster than the calcaneus. So why does the talus go backwards and forwards? Well, I think it's this nutcracker thing. As we get lateral angulation, the navicular is swinging backwards and it pushes the talus back up over the calcaneus. So what happens at the talo-calcaneal joint? Backward movement of the talus over the calcaneus. Huson was fully aware of the posterior translation movement of the talus over the calcaneus when the midfoot angulated outwards and underwent supination. And that the talus got pushed backwards. He described this talar rotation as being tethered to the calcaneus by the posterior part of the talo-calcaneal interosseous ligament. So that's indicated by that little blue arrow. And he said that the ligaments, the capsular ligaments of the two joints at that particular area were short. So again there was an added tethering to make that the fulcrum of rotation of the talus over the calcaneus. He indicated the rotational movements of the talus over the calcaneus by this series of 4 lines which indicated the progression of the articular processes of the talus, which started off absolutely plumb on top of the articular surfaces of the calcaneus. That's the anterior and the posterior. And that when this happened, the talus externally rotated over the calcaneus. So the talus and its posterior articular surface rotated in this way. So what I've done is I've drawn the talus on top of the calcaneus and its articular surfaces, and I've rotated it, tethered to the interosseous ligament. And it's drawn as though the talus is being pushed backwards over the calcaneus, which is what happens. So it's going to be pushed backwards and it rotates. So the talus externally rotates over the calcaneus because it's being pushed backwards, and the posterior joint moves medially over the calcaneus. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Do you see? See that? It moves medially. And it's exactly what happens. Now, when you do stereophotogrammetric studies of this joint and its movements, you get a series of relative talo-calcaneal axes, and they move backwards relative to the interosseous talo-calcaneal ligament. So this seems to support Huson's concept that the talus is moving back and it's got a movable axis, a series of, and it passes through the upper attachment of the interosseous ligament, as opposed to the calcaneo-cuboid joint, which has one axis by all the calculations that are available in the literature. So when this rotation occurs, the talus externally rotates over the calcaneus, but if you look at the lower pair as the talus moves backwards and rotates, its articular surface will go up the slope of the calcaneus. So if the talus is to remain horizontal, the calcaneus has to supinate beneath it. The outer part of the talus is pushing the calcaneus down into supination because it's climbing up the slope of the articular surface on the lateral side. Huson also very cleverly noticed that the capsular ligaments of the talo-calcaneal joint remained tight throughout its range of movement. Okay, the ligament was oblique, and therefore, if that happened, the distance horizontally would decrease. But the attachment moved upwards as well, and therefore the ligament remained tight because it was moving away in an upward direction. So the pattern of movement at the talo-calcaneal joint is pretty well fixed. So there's the talus moving forwards over the calcaneus with the midfoot in pronation. That is our dissected specimen with the midfoot supinated, and a representation of the talus on the calcaneus with the bones. In all rotatory positions of the foot in the dissected specimen, we found that the peripheral ligaments of the talo-calcaneal joint remained tight. There's the cervical, the lateral calcaneofibular and calcaneotalar, and the posterior talus calcaneal. The medial capsular ligament also remained tight. And you can see that the hypotenuse of the triangle was of the same length in those two, keeping those ligaments at the same degree of tension. Is it the hypotenuse? No, the diagonal, beg your pardon. So when the midfoot is pronated, the talus moves forwards over the calcaneus and the midfoot is pronated. When it moves backwards, the midfoot is in supination, and these various joint surfaces become exposed. There's the talar facet moved backwards. And because the talus is pushed on the posterior joint, the calcaneus... Yeah. The calcaneus, yes. The calcaneus has become supinated beneath. So we can come back to that, yes? Well, I wonder if you can bear, if we just go back to the end of the calcaneo-cuboid joint, to try and make sure that you understand what I think is the link between the three joints, because they all have to move together. If you stop movement at one, then the whole thing grinds to a halt. I'm trying to suggest to you that the only joint of the three that has no leeway in it is the calcaneo-cuboid joint. Its movement is absolutely the same all the time. Its ligaments are tight throughout its range of movement, and the cuboid swings around the proximal attachments of the dorsal and plantar ligaments. If this is the right calcaneus and the cuboid is there, as there's outward angulation so that the cuboid moves medially, it supinates relative to the calcaneus because its cuboid beak is going upwards underneath the sustentaculum tali. It is angulating inwards, and so it's inward angulation, and it is going down into plantar flexion. So the results of this are that the cuboid can ensure that the central forefoot segment, which is the middle of the foot, navicular and cuboid, actually supinates. It actually angles inwards to allow the outward angulation at the transverse tarsal joint, and it plantarflexes to allow the elevation of the longitudinal structure. And as it does that, it means that the medial side gets scrunched because of the nutcracker effect. The navicular swings backwards and pushes the talus up the slope of the calcaneus. Now, when you weight bear, that's going to be reversed slightly, but that's a little thing to adjust. So if we just go back, I'm suggesting to you that the calcaneo-cuboid joint is not a non-essential joint. It is the essential joint of the controlling the movements at these three coordinated joint surfaces. It remains stable throughout its range of movement, and the pivot is the proximal attachments of the dorsal and plantar ligaments. So here we have opening on the inside if we get inward angulation, and the talus can then slide forwards over the calcaneus. The distance between the sustentaculum tali and the navicular increases. If we have outward angulation, lateral angulation, then the navicular and the cuboid swing medially. Then they come closer, the navicular comes closer to the sustentaculum tali, and the talus gets pushed backwards. And we've shown this very nicely with this scan. There's the talus going backwards, the outward angulation, the cuboid supinating further than the calcaneus, and the beak going into the coronoid fossa. And here it comes out again as the midfoot pronates, and the talus slides down the slope. So going back again with the supination and outward supination of the midfoot and outward angulation at the transverse tarsal joint. As we said, the talus is being pushed backwards due to the nutcracker effect. The calcaneus is supinating, but not as far as the cuboid. And the talus doesn't supinate at all. Cuboid beak is in its little fossa. So we go back again, and everything is pronated, inward angulation, as on your left side. And the talus has slid forwards because the navicular has moved away from the calcaneus. Now, Huson's drawings, and because the talus gets pushed backwards, it rotates around the interosseous talo-calcaneal ligament, and it also goes backwards. You remember I tried to explain the Huson outlines, and then a drawing of the talus as it rotates around the interosseous talo-calcaneal ligament. So it's going up the slope of the posterior joint as the talus. And if the calcaneus just stayed like that, then the talus would tilt because it's going up a slope on the outer side. But it's got to stay level, so in fact the calcaneus supinates beneath it. Is that all right? And because it moves backwards, we get this series of relative talo-calcaneal joint axes, and they're all going through the upper attachment of the interosseous talo-calcaneal ligament. And that's just trying to show you how the talus externally rotates, and in the lower side, as the talus goes backwards, because it stays horizontal, the poor calcaneus is forced to undergo supination beneath it. And the talo-calcaneal joint, the peripheral ligaments, I stress that, remain tight throughout the range of movement because the talus goes upwards as the ends of the ligament come near each other in the horizontal plane. They actually move apart in the vertical. And that's the demonstration of the lateral ligaments remaining tight as pronation and supination occur at the midfoot level, and the talus moves backwards over the calcaneus. That's the cervical ligament, lateral calcaneofibula, and the posterior talo-calcaneal. And the medial capsule remains tight as well. So that is the talus moved forwards when there's inward angulation at the transverse tarsal joint. And you can see the calcaneo-cuboid joint is closed laterally, and all the ligaments around the head of the talus are tight because the navicular has been pushed away from the sustentaculum tali and the calcaneus. And then, when the midfoot is supinated and the lateral hinge of the calcaneo-cuboid joint means that the navicular is coming backwards relative to the calcaneus, it pushes the talus backwards and we get that appearance with the exposed inferior joint on the calcaneal side, articular surface, and the calcaneus, as you see, has had to supinate underneath the talus as the talus has moved backwards because it's gone up the slope of the posterior joint and made the calcaneus supinate. So the poor calcaneus has got squeezed, has had to supinate, and as the lateral angulation has occurred with the supination, the cuboid has supinated further relative to the calcaneus. So the midfoot segment has supinated the greatest, calcaneus halfway, the talus not at all. So the talus remains horizontal. The distal surface of the calcaneus supinates a certain amount, and the cuboid supinates even more. Now, as you can see, here we are with supinated outward angulation, pronated and inward angulation. There is the cervical ligament, and there it is, and they're both. It's tight in both positions. So, as the calcaneus is forced into supination, you can imagine that that cervical ligament attached to the head and neck of the talus pulls it and pulls the front of the talus into external rotation. It has to. Now, what we found in our specimen was that when the midfoot was inwardly angulated and the midfoot was pronated, in other words, the longitudinal structure was flattened, all the ligaments around the head of the talus, that's the medial, the navicular part of the bifurcate, were tight. So there they are, and they're tight. The spring ligament and the anterior part of the deltoid. We then supinated our specimen, and they all became slack. And we thought, that's daft. You can't have slack ligaments, the foot would fall apart. We looked on the lateral side, and all the ligaments in the lateral side of the talo-calcaneo-navicular joint, there's the dorsal aspect, the lateral part of the bifurcate, there's the navicular part, that's the interosseous, and that's the cervical. They're all tight, in pronation and inward angulation. And then we supinated the midfoot. The cervical stayed tight. The cuboid part of the bifurcate remained tight. But the navicular part was slack, and if you can see in there, so was the interosseous. So the ligaments around the head of the talus that were controlling the talo-navicular joint became slack when the middle of the foot was supinated and outwardly angulated. Ligaments tight, pronated. Ligaments slack with the midfoot supinated. And this puzzled us for a while. We thought, gee, what? And then it suddenly dawned on us. When the midfoot was pronated, the navicular was pulled away from the calcaneus, so all the ligaments would be put under tension. When there was outward angulation and the nutcracker effect came in, the navicular moved nearer the calcaneus and the sustentaculum tali, so all the ligaments going between those two bones became slack. And then, of course, the penny dropped. They were slack because we were looking at a specimen in an unweight-bearing position. We suddenly realized it was the nutcracker effect. The navicular had moved proximally, and so all those ligaments would be naturally slack. So we decided that obviously the thing to do was just see what happened if we put a weight-bearing thrust on the talus. And it was magic. That's the foot flat. Top left, you can see the ligaments are slack. Top bottom, on the right-hand side, bottom right. All the ligaments around the head of the talus magically became taut. This was a heel elevation position, and once more, when non-weight bearing, the talo-calcaneal interosseous, the medial talo-calcaneal joint ligaments, and the navicular part of the bifurcate were slack. Just a little weight bearing on the talus, and it slid very slightly forwards, just a millimetre or two, down the posterior slope, down the slope of the posterior joint. And the navicular was pushed a little bit away from the calcaneus, and they all tightened. So when non-weight bearing, the navicular was moving backwards with the talus, and the talo-calcaneal interosseous and all ligaments around the head of the talus became lax. soon as we became weight-bearing, there was a little anterior translation, anterior slide of the talus, and they all tightened. So the problem was solved as far as we were concerned. The calcaneo-cuboid ligaments were tight all the time, throughout the range of movement of these three joints. The talo-calcaneal joint, the peripheral ligaments, remained tight all the time, and only the interosseous became slack with non-weight bearing in a supinated midfoot position. All around the talo-calcaneo-navicular joint became slack if we were non-weight bearing in a supinated position. And all these lax ligaments became tight as soon as we put a weight-bearing thrust upon the talus. So that's just stating that what I've just said. Peripheral ligaments of the talo-calcaneal joint, dorsal and plantar ligaments of the calcaneo-cuboid remain tight throughout. But we needed the talar slide mechanism of weight bearing to tighten the anterior talo-calcaneal interosseous and the capsular ligaments for the talo-calcaneo-navicular joint. Now, during the weight-bearing stance phase, this talar slide adjustment has to be occurring all the time as the midfoot undergoes swing, lateral and medial movement together with supination and pronation. This slight thrust of the navicular away from the calcaneus will help to tighten the long plantar ligament. And I suggest that the lateral hinge mechanism that I have described of the calcaneo-cuboid joint can explain the anterior-posterior translation of the talus over the calcaneus, and it can provide an explanation for the coordinated movements at these three joints in a closed chain system. It also explains why movements of the calcaneus are intermediate between those of the cuboid and the talus, and that it's a halfway house. Now here is the three-dimensional studies, and I hope that you will be able to see the talus rotating externally and internally. You will see the calcaneus supinating a little, and the cuboid and the navicular supinating even more as outward angulation occurs. Horizontal dome of the talus, and the midfoot is going to supinate. At the moment, the midfoot is fully pronated, and that's what we're going to go to. Isn't that beautiful? Now I want you to just take particular note that that is the articular surface of the posterior joint on the calcaneus. That is the calcaneo-cuboid joint, and the cuboid has moved medially, and the joint has opened up laterally, and the beak is in its little fossa in there. And we're going back to the supinated. And now we're going back to the pronated position. So the calcaneo-cuboid joint is being closed as the midfoot pronates, and you can see that the posterior joint articular surface disappears as the talus moves forwards relative to the calcaneus. So is that all right? Are you beginning to understand? It's the outward swing, and as the talus externally rotates, it slides up the back of the posterior joint and makes the calcaneus supinate underneath it. And at the midfoot level, the cuboid is moving medially. It is adducting, and its beak is going into the fossa, and that means that the cuboid has to supinate even further. So the talus stays okay, but externally rotates. The calcaneus supinates a little, and the cuboid and the navicular supinate a little further. And now we're going back, pronated. Navicular is on the end of the talus, which is fully internally rotated. That's a line across the surface of the midfoot. The foot is fully pronated. You can see that the midfoot supinates as the talus externally rotates. And that's the range of movement. Start again with the foot fully pronated. The dorsal margin, the anterior articular surface of the calcaneus is seen there, and I've put a line across it. That's the anterior edge of the posterior facet of the talus. That's going to remain horizontal. Talus is going to externally rotate, and the midfoot supinate. The calcaneal facet would be exposed as the talus rotates backwards. Anyway, if you have this, you can all play with it hours on end. When the midfoot is fully angled inwards and pronated, the calcaneo-cuboid joint is closed laterally. That's the upper margin of the the calcaneus, and that's the upper margin of the cuboid. And if you watch them, then the cuboid supinates further than the calcaneus, as you'd expect now. So there we are. The cuboid supinates relative to the calcaneus, and the calcaneus supinates relative to the talus. And I did the measurements just for old time's sake. So the lateral hinge mechanism of the calcaneo-cuboid joint explains the antero-posterior translation of the talus over the calcaneus. Provides an explanation of the coordinated movements at the intertarsal joints in a closed chain system. Self-explanatory. Supination of the twist of the forefoot and the hindfoot on the right to compensate for pronation in the middle of the foot, and the opposite on the left to your left. And the calcaneus pronates and supinates half as far as the navicular and cuboid. Talar dome remains horizontal. So we still think that we can regard the foot as having a central longitudinal beam structure, calcaneus, talus, and the forefoot segment, supported by 3 layers of ligaments, and that with the talus slide mechanism, the ligaments around the 3 major joints can be kept taut and tight throughout the range of movement of the weight-bearing foot as its midfoot supinates and pronates. Now, it is extremely difficult. I note that 3-dimensional movements is a problem. But I hope that if you take away the MRI scan, you can understand and look to see that the midfoot always pronates or supinates further than the calcaneus, and that there is a reason for the talus moving backwards, is it gets scrunched by the navicular and pushed backwards because the hinge, the important pivotal hinge, is at the calcaneo-cuboid joint. So we have to ask ourselves, what purpose do these postural changes serve? Why do we have this lateral swing movement as a unique mechanism, and how are they controlled?